My guest today is a legend. He's one of those people whose intros could genuinely take longer than the show itself. Suffice to say, he is having a long and distinguished career, which has seen him either be a board member or non-exec for First Group, EAMS Group, Heathrow Airport, Tube Lines, the Commission for Integrated Transport, Transport for Greater Manchester, TfL. I could go on, which is why most would keep it simple and simply welcome you as the CEO of Transport Times. David Begg, it is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Peter, thank you. I've never been called a legend before. My wife's in the background. She heard it and she started to laugh. I'm not even a legend in my own house. but thank you for that very, very kind introduction. We're living in so uncertain times, and anyone who thinks they can predict the future and what's going to happen to the economy and working patterns, what the impact is going to be on public transport, anyone can predict that with certainty. They're going to make a lot of money, and they're much better than I am. There's no doubt that it is worrying. It's the first time in our lifetime that a government has encouraged people not to use public transport. That's a first. And I understand why, I get it. I'm not being critical. What we don't know is, are there any long-term ramifications from that once we come out the other side from COVID-19? Is there going to be any permanent change in people's mode of choice? And is it going to lead to more people into car and less people into public transport? I don't think so. I doubt that strongly. I mean, I think we might see more walking and cycling, but the arguments for public transport haven't changed. The car is such an inefficient user of road space and still far too polluting that the economic and environmental arguments for public transport will remain. In fact, they'll get stronger. But I think we need a marketing exercise to try and get people confident in using public transport again. That's the key. I mean, I remember when we had the London bombings in 2005, and one of the best things that Transport for London did was to get the tube running the following day. When you think about that, we'd lost 35 people from the bombings, splashed all over the television, and you can understand how people would have lost their confidence in using public transport. But Transport London got the system running the next day. It's a bit like falling off your bike, albeit nothing like as serious as bombings. But you need to get back on it right away. You need to get confidence in public transport straight away. So I see this as being a really big marketing job, because even once the virus is gone, fingers crossed, people will still be a little bit nervous. And I guess if I'm worried about anything, the one thing I'd be looking at more than anything is car ownership statistics. Now, if there's an increase, I haven't seen any figures on this yet, it might be too early, but if people have decided to buy a car, they don't already have one, or they maybe gone from one car to two car households because they're nervous about using public transport, that's worrying, because for every new car on Britain's roads, there are 365 fewer bus journeys a year. So there's this direct correlation between car ownership. As car ownership rises, bus patronage tends to fall. So that's the one thing I'd look at. But again, I'm on the optimistic side here. I think public transport will eventually come out of this stronger, and it has to.
And I would agree, right? I think that, in every challenge comes the basis of an opportunity. And one of the questions which has fast become a mainstay on this program is about silver linings. So I'm curious to think about what kind of silver linings you think there could be, because, you're absolutely right in terms of and we're seeing examples of positive short-term events. If you look at the International Energy Agency forecast, they're saying that carbon emissions will be down by 8% this year. And that's in no small part, obviously, to the lifting of smog over major cities and so on, as car ownership over the period of lockdown has declined. And that is a very real, albeit short-term, positive externality from the virus. Do you think that has legs, or do you think that the legs of it depends on how we can mobilize that marketing machine?
I think it does have legs. I wish that more people were concerned about climate change and CO2 than there are, but there's no doubt that there's a large amount of concern amongst people when it comes to local air quality and the fact that it does kill people prematurely. And I think one of the silver linings to come out of this is the fact that for the first time people have experienced good quality air. They can see what it's like with a lot less traffic, and people like that. People love that. So there's nothing like it's almost like we've had a live demonstration of what it's like without a lot less traffic and fewer planes in the sky and less noise. And a lot of people like that. I mean, I don't want to. It's difficult to generalize here because I suspect, and I'm not a psychologist, but this lockdown's impacted on people in very different ways. So you get some people who think, oh, great, I'm able to breathe, I'm able to think, I'm able to meditate, I'm able just to slow down here and get out of this rat race for a bit. And a lot of people think, wow, I love this. Other people will find that a challenge to their mental health. Cooped up at home, not mingling with other people. So people are responding in very, very different ways, I think, to this lockdown period.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I think it's one of the things that struck me personally is how uneven people's experiences as workers have been during the lockdown period, particularly that discrepancy between frontline and traditional desk-based, if you like. You have the frontline folks arguably keeping the country moving versus the desk-based folks sitting from home and complaining about the four-wall prison that surrounds them. And it's a very different perspective on a very challenging time. I'm interested in what you said earlier, though, David, in terms of, predicting the future. No one can, and they'd be very wealthy individuals if they could. But that is very much the point of our show. So we can navel gaze and hypothesize somewhat. And I'd like to kind of think about what the frontline of the future really means in your eyes. I mean, I think the table stakes here are to agree that frontline work, particularly in transportation, will be as relevant and as prevalent, and ultimately frontline transport workers have reasons to be optimistic. And I was listening to Graham Curry's podcast from Monash University in Melbourne the other day, and he's been looking at the evidence after other major incidents, shall we say, whether it's previous pandemics like SARS, which is reckoned to be both more contagious and deadly than coronavirus, security or terror threats like the bombings in 2005, as you were saying earlier, Olympic years, economic crises, and so on. And there's an enormous amount of change and disruption during those events. But all of the evidence suggests that in the long term, our behavior normalizes and previous patterns of patronage returns. How bullish are you about the extent to which we will recover and those jobs in frontline transport will be safe?
I'm really optimistic, right? I think we will, but the short to medium term, as we can adjust to this with lower demand and patronage is really challenging. I mean, I'll give you a better example than even the London bombings in 2005. I mean, if you think the Twin Towers coming down in New York in 2001, with 3,500 people losing their lives. Now, how nervous would people be about flying after that? And now here's the thing, right? We haven't got rid of that terrorist threat. We've mitigated it, but we accept that risk. We fly, and aviation's got a fantastic track record in keeping people safe. But you need to be a fool to say that terrorist threat has gone away. Now, hopefully, with COVID-19, we get a virus, and the threat of that virus or some other virus appearing is probably, not quite as severe as the threat of a terrorist attack on aviation. So we adjust. We go back to normal. But I'm hoping that we don't lose sight of some of the upsides that we've witnessed personally as a result of this lockdown. There's a lot of good upsides. Quality air, better to live in cities. That's how we can retain some of that. At the same time, having vibrant, thrusting cities that are full of life and people moving around.
No, I agree. It's very important to take those silver linings forward into whatever the status quo becomes. And it's good to hear your confidence around frontline jobs in transportation. And I think the analogy with terrorist incidents, whether it's in London and New York, is well made. By our very nature, we are human beings, and we're born to adapt. Ever since we started walking on this planet. So if we're optimistic about those jobs within frontline transport industry, what role do we see people playing within those frontline transport jobs, and does that change? I ask that because I think a lot of people have said for some time, autonomous vehicles, for example, will be the future. Interestingly, the number of autonomous car trips in the last year has been still just a few thousand. But autonomous trains, on the other hand, there's hundreds of millions of those every day. Something like, I think it's half of all trains in Asia are autonomous. And certainly we're starting to see autonomous buses come to the fore. I think there are 5 different tests in European cities later this year. So something which has kind of historically been seen as a threat to the industry is really its greatest opportunity. Public transport is embracing and dominating the use of autonomous vehicles. And I think, where does that leave frontline transport jobs? Well, do we start to see a shift where frontline transport workers are more focused on customer service orientated roles, where they're communicating, reassuring passengers, and being ambassadors for public transport, for want of a better phrase, and not necessarily driving? What do you think?
Yeah, look, I think we can do this 2 ways. We can get this wrong. We can say we're not going to change people's jobs despite the fact that we've got new technology. So it means that you could have an autonomous, let me give you an example of Docklands Light Rail, which has been autonomous since it was introduced in the 1980s. This is not new technology. This is over 30 years ago. We had autonomous trains in Docklands Light Rail. My dad was a train driver, and when I took him to see it, he was really nervous. He thought, wow. He was nervous about his own job. He thought, I'm not needed, But they've got someone on board who's doing a customer service job. Now, the worst thing possible would be for you to introduce the Docklands Light Rail autonomous trains and have someone sitting there at the front of the train, not moving out of their seat and doing nothing. In there, in the case of an emergency, what you've got is someone who can mingle with the customers, check fares, make sure they're okay. And there's all sorts of examples of how new technology is changing people's jobs. So if you look at, I think one of the toughest jobs in Britain is to be a bus driver, right? Especially in a busy city. Some of my friends, when they come down from Scotland, they hate the prospect of driving in London and ask me what it's like. So you can imagine a bus driver driving in London and at the same time having to take people's fares. At the same time, having to make sure that the customers are okay. It's a demanding job. If I'm looking at value for money, the value for money we get from bus drivers is better than anything. Now, along came COVID-19, and suddenly we realized that they were much more exposed than even frontline health professionals. Wow. There's, we should be clapping for bus drivers. But I felt that before COVID-19. I've always felt that they had one of the toughest jobs. And what the industry had to do was to move into this excellent customer service phase. Because we all know it. We know good customer service when we see it. If we go into a restaurant and we've got a really good waiter or waitress, and we're made to feel really welcome, it changes the dynamic. You can walk into a school and a hospital and you can see really good customer service. There's a feel about it. There's an energy about it. You can walk onto a bus, and if you've got a really lively, happy bus driver, it changes the experience. Now, I'm the first to accept that because the job is so challenging, it's difficult to get that type of person in. But if we move to a more autonomous world, and it's going to take a lot longer to get autonomous buses than it is autonomous trains, just the nature of driving in busy cities. But if we move more towards an autonomous world, then we can recruit more and more people who've got that focus on excellent customer care. It's a different mindset. It's a different approach. There's a different energy to it. And we have to reproduce that customer care on buses that people expect elsewhere. I mean, you're going to get me off on one here, right? But I remember when I was a politician in Edinburgh, in the local council, and I chaired the transport committee about 25 years ago. And I firstly represented a relatively middle-class ward, and they were very demanding, the people in that middle-class ward, rightly so, and they knew what I should be doing for them as their local councillor. And then I moved to a very working-class ward with more deprivation, and they were just not demanding at all. Now, I think by and large, bus passengers aren't anything like as demanding as rail passengers or motorists or air passengers, right? I can't put my finger on it, but my parents were like this. They never complained about anything. They just accepted things the way they were. Now, bus passenger satisfaction tends to be higher than a lot of other modes of transport. Is that because bus passengers are much more accepting and much less demanding? I think so. Now, if we're going to get modal shift, you never hear this language now. But 20 years ago when I was advising the government, the main focus was how do we get people out of their cars onto public transport? And we knew that the product that we were offering for motorists had to be better. It had to entice them out of their cars, it had to be reliable, quicker, good customer care, easy ticketing, all of that stuff that we'll gradually get in there. But it's a different product that you have to offer if you're going to get that modal shift. And it's that frontline employee, the bus driver, who's absolutely pivotal in creating that new environment.
It's super interesting because you look at it and you start to think, well, actually, is there a different product, to your point, required again? Have passengers' buying criteria shifted in the wake of this virus? One of the things that's been kind of top of mind for me, looking at the French press this week, the French newspaper is not the popular coffee making device. Do we start seeing KPIs changing on the front line of the future, where perhaps hygiene and cleanliness start to overtake punctuality, on-time performance, and so on? It's something that RATP are doing particularly well on the Paris Metro at the moment. Right now, would I rather that my train or my bus was late or clean? Yeah. And I know the answer to that.
Yeah. Look, you can see a less upbeat scenario here, and to quote a former Conservative transport minister who shall remain nameless, why would I want to travel on public transport sitting next to smelly people? Now, this individual was very supportive of public transport. He's using this to try and get into people's mindsets.
Yeah.
When you've got a car, you've got an enclosed space. You don't have to sit next to anyone. It's one of the reasons why car share hasn't taken off. People don't like people getting into their personal space. They love that personal space.
Apart from PTK,
it's why you get road rage, because people think, I'm in my personal space. This is an extension of my living room. So if anyone else comes across them or cuts in front of them, shoot the horn. They're never aggressive. Normally they're aggressive here. And the way you're never as a pedestrian, if someone walks in front of you, oh, sorry, in that British way. Yeah. But in the car, there's something very, very different. Now, COVID-19, Well, I think we'll overcome this pretty quickly, but right now there's a lot of people not using it. People who work for me at Transport Times. I say, look, I understand it. You don't want to jump on the tube. Stay at home, work at home. Their confidence is going to have to be built up again. Right? Because this is not going to be easy. That's why I'm saying that even once the virus we think is behind us and we're really on top of it and we're safe to travel by public transport, there's a big marketing job to build up people's confidence again.
Yeah, no, agreed. That's very interesting, David. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with it. I think, yes, there might be new KPIs for frontline teams and customers and passengers as their buying criteria on public transport changes, and you start to see certain things being more important than others. And yes, frontline work may change as we look to become more autonomous, and necessarily, the role, but not the prevalence of frontline jobs will change. But to your point, I think, the biggest thing that will facilitate that is a marketing exercise, for want of a more grandiose title, but it's about making people feel safe, from, in the same way that they did after those terrorist incidents, feeling safe and clean on public transport, and having that confidence to return. That's one aspect to the marketing exercise, if you like. But also, it's about showing them what we have achieved over the last, the first half of this year, as far as the environment goes. And that in and of itself is a marketing exercise. Arguably, like you said, we've had a little demo or a little pilot, of what clean living and working conditions look like. How can we take that and make sure that retains a spot in public consciousness beyond 2020?
We do. As always, when you're marketing, you're dealing with people's perceptions. Where are people's perceptions, and where do you want them to be? And how do people's perceptions differ from reality? So a lot of people's perceptions, especially motorists, is that the buses are the big polluters. Buses cause congestion and are the big contributor towards poor air quality. The truth of the matter is that one new Euro 6 bus produces less pollution than one new Euro 6 car, despite the fact that they can carry 50 times as many passengers, right? So buses are a key part of the solution, but that's not the perception. They're a key part of the solution for congestion, again, but that's not the perception. I mean, how many times have you heard people say, oh, we need to get the buses off the road. There's too many of them. There's hardly anyone on them. That's what causes the congestion. And it's difficult to shift people's views, because once they've got these views, it's like, apparently, if you meet someone and you form an impression of that person, it takes you about another 50 meetings to shift that impression. And it's a bit like these views that are ingrained in people's mindsets that we have to shift.
No, 100%. I mean, unconscious bias or conscious bias, I guess, transcends human beings. And, you can associate that to anything, really: transport, music, sport. Absolutely. And I have to ask, David, I mean, really interesting getting your views on what could constitute the front line of the future in transport. But just to ask, I suppose, a bit more of a personal question. I mean, yes, you've been a chief exec at Transport Times now for coming up to 15 years, I think it is. But obviously had a kind of a long and varied career before that in a number of different areas. One of the big parts of looking at the front line of the future is to excite people about what that has in store. So what advice would you give to a young David Begg, if I might say, who is starting out in the industry now and was excited about the future prospects and possibilities within the transport space?
Get to know your customers better and deliver for them. Learn best practice in terms of customer care from other sectors. If we look at bus in particular, we tend not to know our customers. We don't know what they think. We don't know what they want. We don't communicate them. We don't tell them, go and agitate at your local town hall to try and get better bus priority to get you to your work or to your hospital appointment quicker. Help us. You're part of this. We want to produce a much better product here. We need your help, because the reason why buses are so different is so many of the decisions that are made around buses are made by the public sector, by central and local government. And then you've got the private operators who run outside of London. And there's that lack of partnership. So, I mean, if I was starting off let's use that specific example, running a bus company. I would want to know my customers. I'd want to communicate with them. I'd want to drop them text messages. I'd want them to reward them for loyalty. I'd want to tell them when, sorry, I'm really hacked off. We couldn't really produce reliable journeys because of these roadworks and because the local authority aren't giving us bus priority on these key routes. But the other thing I'd do is I'd form an incredibly close partnership with the local authority and the highways authority. I would want to know the local politician who's in charge of road space allocation really well and his or her officers. Because without that close partnership, you're never going to deliver. And too often it's adversarial. The local authority blames the buses for running a crap service, and the bus services blame the local authority for not delivering on the proper bus priority, right? And it's a blame game. And as our patronage numbers continue to fall in most parts of the country, we're actually seeing a decline in service and a decline in industry. It doesn't have to be that way. With the right mindset. If I was pointing to examples of real success, you can point to all sorts of indicators. What's car ownership? What's the strength of the economy? Blah, 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 blah. The one thing that I think I could point out to is real good quality people at local government and at bus company level who are focused on delivering for the customer. And when you get that, you get success.
Spot on. And I think that's what I'll take, David. I mean, I think, you know, the frontline of the future in your mind puts a real emphasis on things like marketing, customer service at its most deepest and intimate level, and also communications. And those are skills which are relevant in any business. So it's almost about looking at best practice in, you know, other industries, to be fair, looking outside of bus and thinking about those core competencies which are important no matter what line of work you're in. And going back to basics with those. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Been great to have you on the show, David Begg. Thank you very much.
I look forward to meeting up for a cup of coffee.